when I heard that song was going to be more about Jesus, I thought, well, that's kind of ironic because this is the time when we're going to be talking about the book of Joshua. This is our every month we do a a book on a survey of one of the books of the Bible. And this evening I've chosen the book of Joshua. And I say that's ironic because Joshua is actually the Hebrew name for Jesus. And so more about Jesus, more about Joshua. Joshua and Jesus have the same name. It's kind of interesting. You look at it in the Old Testament, or rather in the New Testament in the King James. And the King James preserves that. And it says, Jesus, the son of Nun, at some point. And of course, who is that but Joshua, the son of Nun? And that's the individual and, of course, the book that we're going to be looking at today. All right. This is the first book that we have after the books of Moses. This is, of course, the sixth book of our Bible. Moses has died. He died at the end of Deuteronomy 34. And now Joshua has taken over, and he has no safety net, or at least not a human safety net, if you will. And that's a scary thought whenever you go out and do things and you don't have the safety net that you once did. And so you wonder if Joshua, as you're reading through it, if you don't know the story ahead of time, you wonder if Joshua is up to the challenge. He had been groomed for this position since we first saw him in Exodus chapter 17, when he was called to defend the Israelites against the Amalekites. I think we see that at the end of that chapter there. This book Joshua covers the conquest of Canaan, though it was incomplete, and the division of the land we see in the last several chapters. So let's consider the main points of this book. The name. What is the name of this book? Why do we call it what it is? The book is named for the central figure of the book, Joshua. This is a custom. Earlier in the books of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, the custom, of course, was to name it after the first line of the book. But for the books of history that we see, from Joshua to Esther, we see that the book is named for the central figure within that book. Of course, some of them don't have central figures, like Kings and Chronicles, and so they are named differently. But the others, for instance, Ruth, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, all have a similar idea here, where the central figure is the name of the book. Samuel is not the main character of his books, except for a few chapters of 1 Samuel. But that's a different topic altogether. We'll get to Samuel eventually. This name, Joshua, means Yahweh is salvation. The Lord is salvation. And that really does fit this book, doesn't it? For the Lord saves Israel through its many extraordinary conquests. We talked about a little bit about the conquest of Jericho earlier this morning. And we saw that amazing, alluded to anyway, that amazing conquest where the walls come tumbling down, and how great that is. Joshua, or Yehoshua in the Hebrew, is that Hebrew name transliterated as Jesus in Greek, which then is translated into Jesus in English. So the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, names this book not Jesus, but Jesus Nous, which is the Grecian, Hellenized, the Greek form of Jesus, the son of Nun, or Joshua, the son of Nun. The author of this book, he's anonymous. He doesn't say who he is. And in fact, that's fairly typical of the books of history. Though anyone who wishes to name an author will credit Joshua with the writing of this book. If Joshua is the author, the first time we see him again is in Exodus 17, which takes place in around 1446 BC. If you were around 30 at the time of that battle against the Amalekites, Joshua 24 and verse 29 states that he was 110 when he died, which would make his death around 1366 BC. Clearly, the events surrounding his death and the later death of Eleazar, the high priest, the son of Aaron, are written by someone else, I should say, toward the end of the book. Similar to the last chapter of Deuteronomy being written by someone other than Moses. Of course, modern unbelieving scholars will place the book much later. They'll do that. I think it may be later than Joshua, with the amount of times that we see the phrase "even to this day." It seems like something that would be stated much after someone contemporary to those events. But I don't really care to speculate too much about that. I certainly believe that the events recorded occurred when it says they did. The primary audience of this book, of course, its date would affect its primary audience. The first people to read this. Based on the themes that we'll see later in this book, I believe the book was written to encourage the Israelites to follow the Lord and to know that they had a divine claim to the land of Canaan. That is a theme that we see in the Pentateuch that is continued in the book of Joshua. They have that claim to that promised land. So whenever it was written, it had to be, whenever it was written, whether you think it's during the time of Joshua or sometime after, whenever it's written, it's clearly written to the Israelites. The only question is at what stage were the Israelites in their faithfulness to God? Were they faithful to God at that time? Were they not? Were they in exile? Were they, who knows? Who knows? It doesn't say. References to other works like the book of Jasher, we see in, I believe, chapter 10, suggest these events were perhaps written elsewhere. At least some of these events were written elsewhere, and perhaps consulted for the writing of this particular book. Let's consider the outline for Joshua, the outline for this book. The first 5 chapters, they are preparing for battle. The first 5 chapters, they are preparing for battle. Chapters 6 through 12, we see the conquests that they have in Canaan. Chapters 13 through 22, the land is divided. Chapters 23 and 24, we have the final orders. Going back to the preparations for battle that they have. In chapter 1, Joshua is commissioned. Joshua, again, he's commissioned. This goes to the themes that we'll see in the book in the next section here. But his commissioning, he is told countless times to be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. You have a task before you. If you walk with the Lord, he will walk with you. So Joshua is commissioned in that first chapter. In chapter 2, we see that Joshua sends a couple spies or messengers to Jericho to go check it out. And we find Rahab is there, the harlot, and she comes and she protects those spies she protects those spies, and then as a result, she is protected from the onslaught, from the attack later to come. In Joshua chapter 3, after the spies have returned and delivered their report, Joshua and the company cross the river Jordan, and they cross it almost very similar to the situation that we saw when they crossed the Red Sea. They cross the Jordan, and the Jordan dries up enough for them to be able to pass through on dry land. We find on that side of the Jordan that they erect several memorial stones to say, hey, this happened here at this particular time. This happened, and we can go back to them and look at this, and they are around even to this day. We have that one of those phrases there. Chapter 5, we find an interesting thing that I find very interesting, but it's almost a renewal of the covenant when we find that the men of Israel at that time, the young ones who were born in the wilderness were not circumcised. And of course, circumcision was a huge deal for the Jews, for the Israelites at this time. They showed it was a covenant sign with God that they had for this old covenant, given all the way back in the time of Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. And it was done, and we see that it should have been done, and in fact, we find that in order for anyone to participate in the Passover feast, those who participated had to be circumcised. We see in Exodus chapter 12. So they may not have been practicing the Passover in the wilderness because of how many people were not circumcised. And yet they find that the unfaithfulness of the wilderness wanderers is made evident here, because they didn't take care of their children. They didn't circumcise them. And so they had to be circumcised at this time in chapter 5, a renewal of that covenant. And then toward the end of the chapter 5, Joshua encounters the Lord. And I have in my notes here, he encounters the Lord. In the passage, we note that he encounters the commander of the Lord's army. And the New King James writers, editors, translators are so certain that this is a reference to deity that they use capitalizations for this particular individual to say that this person is the Lord. And I think that they may be right on that. So he encounters the commander of the Lord's army at this point, on the eve of the conquest of Jericho. And so we see the conquest in chapters 6 through 12. They spend the most amount of time, this book spends the most amount of time on the conquest of central Canaan. We see that in chapters 6 through most of 10. And we see that in chapter 6, of course, we see the destruction of Jericho. The walls come tumbling down. And of course, it's not by their own power, it's not by their own might, but it's because the Lord is fighting for them. They didn't even raise a sword. They didn't have a battering ram. They had no catapults, nothing. Whenever they attacked Jericho, all they had was the Ark of the Covenant and some trumpets. And of course, the soldiers to shout. And the ability to walk around the walls. That's all they did. Walked around the walls once a day for 6 days. And finally on the 7th day, they walk around 7 days. Utter an enormous shout. The walls come tumbling down. And then they go in. The city is laid bare, and they go in and they destroy everything they need to. Great victory there in Jericho. Chapter 7, we talked about that this morning. The failure at Ai. Bethel and Ai are two neighboring towns. Achan had stolen some things from Jericho when they should have been destroyed. And they go up against Ai and are defeated. They go back again to Ai in chapter 8 after the situation with Achan is resolved, and they defeat Bethel and Ai, and the covenant is reestablished at Mounts Gerizim and Ebal, just as we saw should have happened. We saw that in Deuteronomy, in the last several chapters of Deuteronomy. Moses commands this, and it's fulfilled here in Joshua 8. In Joshua 9, I have written down here the Gibeonite deceit. And we talked about this in class the other day. Wednesday night class the other day. The Gibeonites had come to destroy, or not to destroy, they came to make peace with the Israelites. They were a nearby town, and the Israelites, they were afraid of the Israelites. They knew that their mandate was to destroy everyone who is local. And so the Gibeonites are afraid, and they pretend like they are from very far away, and they arrive with old torn clothes, moldy bread, to pretend like that they are from very far, and yet they are from very nearby. And so they end up deceiving Joshua and the company. to thinking that they were from far away, wanting to make peace. And so, once it's revealed that they are from nearby, they are made servants of the Israelites. But that promise not to destroy them is meant to last, and it does last, at least for the most part. There is a moment there when Saul goes against them, but by and large, that covenant with the Gibeonites lasts. This causes the rest of the Canaanites in the region to rise up. They recognize, oh man, Jericho fell, Bethel and Ai fell. The Gibeonites have joined forces with them. We are scared. And so several kings from that region join up, and they come up against Joshua and the Israelites. And there's this huge battle we see in chapter 10. And the Lord fights for them by allowing the day to last a little longer so they can fight, by bringing hail down upon the Israelite, or upon the enemies of the Israelites, upon the Canaanites there, so that they could be destroyed and be killed, to bring Israel to victory. So we see that destruction there in chapter 10. The last few verses of chapter 10, we see a continuation of that. They go on from central Canaan, and they go into southern Canaan. They conquer areas of Judah and those areas in the south. And then after that, in chapter 11, they move north and they destroy areas in northern Canaan. And about halfway through chapter 11 and chapter 12, we see a summary of the conquests. Chapters 13 through 22, it's time to divide the land. So they divide the land. There's a review of the land divided in the Transjordan region, the area east of the Jordan River, by Moses. Chapters 14 and 15, we see Caleb and Judah, their land being apportioned. We see the tribes of Joseph in chapter 16. And in chapters 17 through 19, we see the rest. They're all lumped together in there. Benjamin I think, has a chapter of his own, but we do see several are put in there. Then we see the cities of refuge in chapter 20, and the cities of the Levites in chapter 21. They are not permitted regions. They are not permitted a land area except for several cities in the land, because they are the priests of the people. They have no inheritance except the inheritance of the Lord, which was again talked about during the Old Testament, or during the books of the Pentateuch, in Exodus through Deuteronomy. They don't have that claim. And so here we find that the claim to these cities is made. And then in chapter 22, we find a very interesting story where the Transjordan tribes, Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh, they head across the Jordan. They are allowed to return home, and they return home after the conquests. And we find that they build an altar. And of course, this is contrary to the law, because they needed to build an altar for the. They needed to build an altar for only. They didn't need to build an altar. They had already built an altar with the tabernacle, and they could only worship there. They were only permitted to worship in that area. So we see that they are about to have a fight. But eventually it's worked out to say, no, this isn't meant for worship. This is meant as a memorial, so that we know that the place that we need to go to worship is on this side of the Jordan. Chapters 23 and 24, we see the final orders. Joshua gives his final orders to the Israelites, not to make friends with the Canaanites, but to fight and to continue with the conquest. Because the conquest isn't finished. The conquest isn't complete. And we can see in the book of Judges that very much is the case, that it has not been completed, that there are still some things left undone. In chapter 24, we see the covenant is renewed. And we see that they are told to continue to be faithful to God. And the book ends with the deaths of Joshua and Eleazar, the successors of Moses and Aaron. And then there's a question. Will the Israelites be faithful after these faithful men have died? And then that's where we get to the book of Judges after this. The themes of this book. I have three themes that are present, that I believe are present in this book. The first one, be strong and courageous. The key verses are in Joshua chapter 1 and verse 9. In fact, all of Joshua chapter 1 fits this theme, this idea, and sets up the theme for the book. But chapter 9 condenses it and brings it to very, very clear, very concisely. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And we can see that was a comfort that Moses had given to Joshua throughout the book of Deuteronomy as well. And so this is one of those ideas. We see it as well in chapter 10 and verse 25. Chapter 10 and verse 25. Then Joshua said to them, do not be afraid nor be dismayed. Be strong and of good courage, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight. This was after they had been victorious over the kingdoms of Canaan that had come to destroy them in Joshua chapter 10. And he said, do not falter. Be strong. Be courageous. Keep up the good work. We read, we consider, as we read through the narrative, the question might be, after Moses' death, what was going to happen? Would they be able to conquer the land without their great leader, Moses? Sure, Joshua had proven himself before, but was he up to this great task? Would the people be faithful under him? And of course, we find out that they are. They are faithful under him. There are a few instances where they messed up, where a few of them sinned and made mistakes and did things they shouldn't have done, but by and large, the people were faithful to him and faithful to the Lord. So be strong and courageous. Another theme that I find in this book, God keeps his promises. God keeps his promises. From Genesis to Deuteronomy, there had been promises given to God's people. Recall the first to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. We often point out the land promise, the nation promise, and the seed promise. Of course, the seed promise wouldn't truly be fulfilled until the time of Christ. But the land would be and the land would be completely fulfilled in the time of Solomon. But the nation was established under Joshua's tenure. Key verses here. Joshua chapter 21, verses 43 through 45. So the Lord gave to Israel all the land of which he had sworn to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it and dwelt in it. The Lord gave them rest all around, according to all that he had sworn to their fathers, and not a man of their enemies stood against them. The Lord delivered all their enemies into their hand. Not a word failed of any good thing which the Lord had spoken to the house of Israel. All came to pass. Of course, one might wonder, how then did they fail to completely conquer the land? Because the promise was if they were to go and fight. They didn't always go and fight. They often failed time and again to go and do so. Completely conquer the land. Oh, they're satisfied with what they got. But that's not what God wanted. God wanted the land to be completely theirs, and yet they failed. Still, God kept his promises. God kept his promises. They were able to take possession of what they did, and they were able to dwell in it as God had promised. While these verses are here, there was still much work to be done. So they still had to do the next theme that I find in the book. To choose the Lord. Be strong and courageous. God keeps his promises. and we need to choose the Lord. Joshua encourages faithfulness, particularly in his final marching orders. We see this idea of choosing the Lord throughout the book. Keep doing what God wants, keep following after him, and finally these final marching orders that he gives to his people. Be faithful to God. He encourages faithfulness, particularly at this time. In Joshua chapters 23 and 24, it echoes a lot of the things that Moses had said in Deuteronomy with the blessings and the curses and the encouragement to faithfulness. Of course, we have the famous verse that we often cite in chapter 24. Chapter 24, verses 14 and 15. Now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which our fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods of which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell. But as for me and for my house, we will serve the Lord. Those famous words that he speaks, those great words that he speaks. We have an opportunity to choose the Lord. And again, this echoes something that Moses had said in Deuteronomy chapter 30, I think. Or the verse number 10, I think. It says to choose the Lord. Choose the Lord. See all the great things God has done for you. Narrowing it down. He sees all these great things God has done for you. He's allowed you to conquer this land. He's delivered us out of out of slavery in Egypt. He's seen us through the wilderness. He's given us conquest up to this point. He's done so much for us. Serve the Lord. But if it seems evil to serve him, you can serve these, you can serve these, you can serve these. As for me and for my house, I will serve the Lord. Well, I can't think of a more powerful statement than that in the book of Joshua. Of course, we can say the same about our God today, can't we? See what great things he has done for us. Should we not serve him? What great things, what applications can we take from the book of Joshua? Well, be strong and courageous. We see in the book of Romans, if God is for us, who can be against us? Right? If God is for us, who could be against us? If we are, and of course we see in chapter 5, I love, I like a different version of this section here because it kind of is an interesting thing. In chapter 5, verse 13, and it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, a man was stood opposite him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" I like how he words this and what the response is. Are you for us? Are you on our side? Or are you on their side? And he said, no. No. What? But as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come. Other translations will say, neither. I'm on neither side. I think that's the place that God should have. He's on neither side. It's not up to him to choose sides, is it? It's up to us to choose him. So are we going to choose him? If we do, we have every right to be strong and courageous. If we do, we have every right for God to expect God to keep his good promises for us. We see in scriptures. What are some of those promises? If we obey the gospel, we will be saved. If we're faithful to death, we will receive the crown of life. Man, I'm looking forward to that day. And the book of Joshua helps us to understand that. So many great themes found in this book, and certainly worthy of our study and our attention. I've written in my notes, Joshua is a very important book of the Bible, And then I have right underneath that, of course, that implies that there are less important, or unimportant books, but that isn't the case. Every time we talk about, oh, this is a very important book, that's because they're all important books, right? They're all important. Even in First Chronicles, you try to read through all those genealogies. That's important. For certain things. It's important to understand some of these things. This shows essentially the sequel, the fulfillment of the things promised and commanded in the Pentateuch, in the first 5 books. It also shows the potential that the Israelites had to be faithful to God, and the great promises that flowed from that faithfulness. In order for one to believe that God will keep his promises, you actually got to see him keep his promises. And we see that in the book of Joshua, don't we? We see that very plainly, that his promises were kept. And yet they fail by the time we get to the period of the Judges, after Joshua's death. And we see in the book of Judges, even during Joshua's life, there was some chink in the armor. There were some little seeds of disobedience, even during Joshua's time, that we see. And will be full-blown idolatry and apostasy in the book of Judges. But we see, at the very least, that there was the potential for faithfulness and the potential for things to go as God had commanded. There were these seeds of their future failure planted here with their not fully conquering the land. There's also some overlap with this and some of the events that we see in Judges chapter 1 that highlight those seeds. But by and large, this is a book that focuses on their great successes and their victories. And it is a book that ought to help you and me to be strong and courageous as well. Why? Because God keeps his promises. He promises salvation to you and me if we are faithful to him. So I encourage each one of us to choose him. Because as for me and for my house, we'll serve the Lord. If you have a need this evening, let us know about that. Please come forward as we stand and as we sing.